next speaker. Where to start? It's been such a pleasure to work with on Anthony this semester on the project. It's sometimes as an advisor, as a faculty member, you sign on to work on a project that's just a little bit different from anything you imagined you might work on, and you end up so glad you did. In this case, I've learned so much working with Vaughn, and it's been such a pleasure to talk each week. You will see that Vaughn's project is interdisciplinary in really cool ways. There's philosophy, there's policy, there's some science and technology studies, there's some history, there's cultural studies. There's a lot in here, and for me, one of the greatest things about Vaughn's project is you'll see it's a really cool example of applied ecofeminist philosophy. In some ways, it's kind of like the perfect example for thinking about how issues affecting women's health sort of come together with environmental issues. So really, it's just terrific. So Vaughn, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Hey y'all, my name is Vaughn Ammon. I'm an American Studies and Government double major, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about my project using ecofeminist theory to advocate for better menstrual technology. Just a disclaimer, for time's sake, not everyone who uses or who has a period is a woman, and not everyone who is a woman may have a period. But for brevity, I'm going to use women interchangeably. So identify with that as you may need to. I've been interested in how women have managed their periods since puberty. Always wanted to look into the technology, and then my sophomore year when I was thinking of a project to do, I was talking with my best friend Michaela about litter on the beaches and how I could apply that to my project. So my research is an accumulation of philosophy papers, science and technology, history and policy, and as Derek said, I'm working on an applied ecofeminism paper. To start us out, let's look at a brief history of menstrual technology. This timeline is derived from Shara Brostrow's book, Under Wraps. Up until the 20th century, women hand-produced their own sanitary products, like using flannel, woven fabric. This is where On the Rag comes from. 1896 was the first manufactured disposable product, Johnson & Johnson's Lister's towels. However, most women didn't use this product because it was bulky, scratchy, and they just preferred their own products instead. Then in 1917, Dr. William Robinson published Sex Knowledge for Women and Girls. This changed the perception of homemade products. He said that they were linked to infections and a hideous odor, and the only way to really manage periods was to have like cleanliness and rest. So then in the 1920s also, women's suffrage led to women buying more products and not really using homemade products. And then 1930s, 40s, women are being introduced to the workplace more because of World War II. The invention of the Tampax tampon as well led to women using generally accepting manufactured products and using disposable products more often. Since 1930s, the tampon hasn't really changed. It's gotten sleeker, using more plastic in it. But then in 2003, this was the first major invention since the tampon. That's when the Diva Cup was released to the public. But still, most people are going to use tampons, pads to manage their periods. But now in 2023, we're seeing a growing market for usable products and more concern for the environment. So let's look at these two ads. On the left, you'll see this advertisement for a mega pad belt. We have a young woman saying, "You'll lose your virginity if you use that tampon." There was a common belief that a tampon would break a woman's hymen, and this would result in her losing her virginity. So when tampons first came on the market, only married women were allowed to use tampons. Also, this is one of the reasons why most of our tampons today have a plastic applicator. Women shouldn't be touching their bodies, handling their genitals, because that would be dirty and impure, opposite of the cleanliness and rest information that we had earlier. And then on the right, you'll see a more updated ad from Playtex because it is worse than peeing in the pool. So why is blood worse than peeing in the pool? Because it's political. Periods are like dirty and sickly, and we're super invested in keeping menstruation away from the public and keeping it private for women. However, our timeline also shows us that there was a transition from women controlling their own bodies to more of a scientific and expert-related knowledge about periods. So this could just kind of change it how we look at periods in women's bodies. Okay, so why am I interested in the history of tampons and the usage in the United States, and how does this even connect to environmentalism? Well, 20 billion sanitary napkins, tampons, and applicators in North America alone are sent to landfills every year. This is best case scenario. Other scenarios, they're ending up in sewage systems, waterways, oceans, and when they end up here, they take 20 years to break down in marine environments. Also, the average menstruator uses 9,000 to 10,000 tampons in their lifetime, which accumulates to 300 pounds of waste. So this is a huge ecological problem, and there must be something to do about it. Also, I'm not sure if many of y'all are paying attention to the news last year, but there was a great tampon shortage of 2022. This can be attributed to supply chain issues, and manufacturers were having problems getting the raw goods. The New York Times also tells us that climate change is going to make tampons even more expensive because cotton production is going to get harder due to drought and severe flooding. So what happens when tampons become far more expensive and just difficult to purchase? This takes me to my ecofeminist perspective of my project. Dr. Karen Warren, one of the originators of ecofeminism, says that ecofeminist ethics is grounded in the assumption that the domination of women and of nature are morally wrong and ought to be eliminated. It took me a while to really understand this with Derek, but I think one of the best ways to summarize this is that we cannot improve conditions for women without improving environmental conditions, and we cannot improve the environment without improving conditions for women. Women and children are the most affected when natural disasters happen, so we need to help the environment to also help them. Also, like, how did we even get to this problem? A lot of explanations that ecofeminist theories or ecofeminist philosophers give is the separation of like men and women and nature. These can be religious explanations like Christianity, the story of Adam and Eve, the separation from the Garden of Eden, Eve coming from Adam's rib, or we have self-other theories when we do a man and woman or self and other. The other is subjected to exploitation and domination. We also see the womanizing of nature. This was really fascinating to me, but like the rape of nature, Mother Nature, and virgin forests. When we see nature as a woman or female, since we're in a patriarchal society, we tend to exploit and dominate like the resources in the environment. Also, we animalize women. We call women pussies, bitch, old hens. So this is the same thing. When we see women as non-human, we dominate them as well. However, there are different perspectives, like Anna brought up. Braiding Sweetgrass was a super influential book. Robin Wall Kimmerer explains the story of Sky Woman and how we can have a better relationship with the environment and with women overall. And we can have a coexistence relationship with nature rather than domination. There's a lot more I can go into this, but this is just the surface of my project. So what are the practical implications of ecofeminism? You'll see in the middle, this is an advertisement for Tampax from World War II when women were overwhelmingly involved in the workforce. Women were finding economic independence during this time, and Tampax and other products were used to hide women's periods and keep them active in the workforce, even while menstruating. So women had a lack of knowledge about the products that they could use. Tampax was giving them that knowledge for these products to reduce absenteeism. And then on the right, we'll see a young girl looking into a mirror and seeing a prettier version of herself. For the sake of time, I'll leave a lot of this analysis up to y'all because there's a lot we can say about it. But just in general, menstrual hygiene pamphlets, film strips, and advertisements became increasingly popular and addressed towards young girls as consumers. Kotex and other companies were interested in making these young girls become lifelong customers. They put a lot of money and effort into making them customers, and so it's going to take a lot of time to kind of undo this thinking and this advertising that these companies did. Okay, so after a long history of modern women using using tampons and pads, the data is demonstrating that these products are too expensive for American women to consistently use to manage their periods. 1 in 4 American teens have missed class due to lack of access to period supplies, and 1 in 5 low-income women miss class or work due to lack of access. So now it's no longer a lack of knowledge about period supplies, but it's difficult to access these expensive products, and the prices are only going to rise with climate change. So with all this absenteeism, states must be doing something to alleviate it, right? Kind of. You'll see in these two maps, we have examples of states that provide free period products in schools, and then also states where period products are no longer taxed at a normal rate. However, there are some issues with these policies. A lot of states still aren't requiring that schools provide free period products to students. And then also the sales tax rates. Sometimes stores are alleviated from the taxation, but this burden is still going on to the consumers. Also, most states don't have any sustainable products in their policies. New York so far is the only one that's kind of initiated policy that has a menstrual cup in it. Connecticut, however, has recently passed House Bill 5272, which requires that free period products be put in schools without stigmatization, also in homeless shelters and in prisons. So, what is the solution for this domination of women in the environment? Currently, only 5% of women are using reusable menstrual products. Like companies and schools don't expose young women to the menstrual cup in the same way as tampons and pads. We've seen from the history how popular tampons and pads were, and it's going to take a lot of effort and destigmatization about these sustainable products. The good news is studies show that when young women adopt the menstrual cup with friends, it yields over a 70% adoption rate. So women are way more likely to try this product if they're doing it with their friends. The cup is, with proper care, can last up to 10 years. Think of how much trash that's saving, how much money that's saving women and states or governmental institutions if they're implementing the menstrual cup over other period products. So in 2023, there are a lot more products that women can choose from, but you'll see in this picture, companies are introducing colors to kind of stand out in the crowd, and they're also using worse materials, so we do need to be careful about what kind of products we're looking at for these sustainable products. So in conclusion, the menstrual cup should be considered when creating public policy for period products to alleviate the burden on women and also the environment. These are a few of my resources, and I just want to give a special shout out to everyone at the Goodwin Nearing Center, to Derek for our fun conversations, and to Jen and Kelly for snacks and positivity and encouragement during my time here.
So to introduce our next speaker, I'd like to, there's Doug, Professor Doug Thompson, please.
It's my, you don't need to applaud me, but it's my pleasure to introduce GNCE. A lot of you, I think, know Maddie. She's sometimes a little quiet, but she's a wonderful dancer. What I don't think most people know is she has a real love of photography and an incredible eye. And so initially, she came to me about an SFP idea about looking at glaciers and glacial change related to climate change. And she's a great scientist, and so it made sense to kind of look at this from a scientific perspective. In talking to her, we decided to kind of go beyond just the science, and she's using these kind of artistic skills she's got to also bring photography to it. So it's a really exciting project. I'm really enjoying working with her on this. She's also a very brave soul. So when most people headed, to warmer climates for spring break, she headed to a colder climate, which is not surprising since last summer she went swimming in the Arctic Ocean, something you could never get into. So anyways, she's got some really fun stories to tell you, and very excited to bring her up here.
I'm an environmental studies major and a minor in philosophy. And today I'll be talking about the effects of climate change on glaciers in Iceland, as you can probably tell from the picture. So a fun fact, did you know that glaciers in Iceland cover approximately 10% of the land, and which corresponds to around 9 millimeters of global sea level rise? So that's just to give you an idea of like how much how important glaciers are in Iceland and the potential for global sea level rise that exists there. So a little bit of background to start. I'm going to talk about how glaciers actually form. So glaciers form when large amounts of snow is put under extreme pressure. And so as snow accumulates, the air gets drawn out of the snow as it gets compressed, and it eventually compresses itself into glacial ice. And then you can see this in the little image over there. And this process can take up to hundreds of thousands of years depending on climate conditions. So in the Antarctic and the Arctic, it usually takes a lot longer than it would in temperate climates because in temperate climates, snow and ice melts and then refreezes, which helps it compress and speeds up the process. Whereas in colder climates, it actually takes a lot longer. So an important part of understanding glaciers is understanding glacial processes. So glaciers lose mass through different ablation processes like evaporation and melting. And so that entirety of that process is called ablation. And then glaciers gain mass from precipitation in the accumulation zone, which is usually at the top of the glacier. And the ablation and accumulation in itself encompasses what we call the mass balance, which is a way of understanding how much the glacier has gained mass and how much has been lost. And this mass balance helps determine the stability of the glacier throughout time. And so from that, we can understand the equilibrium line, which is an elevation in the glacier that shows where there is a balance between the accumulation and ablation that's going on in the glacier. If the amount of mass that's lost through ablation exceeds the amount of mass gained through accumulation, the equilibrium line will move up in elevation. And glacial retreat happens when the rate of ablation at the margin exceeds the rate of ice flow to the margin. So the margin moves up in elevation. However, if the amount of mass gained through accumulation exceeds the amount of mass lost through ablation, the glacier will grow, which will lead to glacial advance. So why is this important? Well, glaciers can tell us a lot about climate conditions, and with climate change, higher temperatures have led to increased glacial melt, which, as we all know, leads glaciers to sometimes even disappear, and that has been projected. So one way to document this is through repeat photography. And so this is a practice where you take a baseline image, which can be your own original image, or it can be a historical image, and then using that you as a baseline, then you take repeat images in the same conditions throughout time, so over a period of several years. This can be difficult, especially if you're not sure that the image that you took will be used again as a part of a repeat photography project, and this can be especially challenging when working with historical images because it is difficult to find the exact location and the exact settings and all of the details that go into making a photograph. And that's actually me in Iceland trying to recreate a photograph. So for my project, this is an honors thesis, which is an ongoing project since this is only my first semester. So my methodology for this project was obtaining scientific research through a literature review of recent and past climate studies on glaciers, as well as documenting glacial changes through repeat photography. So my results will focus on 3 different glaciers in Iceland: Vatnajökull Glacier, Hofsjökull Glacier, and Landjökull Glacier. All of these are important glaciers in Iceland. Vatnajökull Glacier is actually the largest glacier in Europe, and the combination of these 2 glaciers can tell us a lot about climate change and its effects on glaciers. So, for my preliminary results, I found in a study from 2019 that close to half of the total mass change during a 129 period, over half of the mass change occurred from geological years 1994 to 1995 and 2018 to 2019, which indicates a serious increase since previous years. It was also found that on average, glacial runoff due to geothermal melting has increased significantly since 1890 and 1891, where it was 1.5 gigatons in 1890 and 1891, and that has now risen to 2 gigatons since 1994-1995. So the study found that higher temperatures during this period, so 1994, 1995, and onwards, has shown a decline in glaciers in Iceland, which is synchronous with glacier decline elsewhere in the world. And this is a part of my project where I focused more on repeat photography. On the left is Professor Doug Thompson's photo that he took back in Iceland in 2013. And on the right is my photo, which I took this past spring in 2023. And although the location and the angle is not exactly the same, it is a pretty close match. And as you can see, there has been quite a big difference. And another thing to note is that Professor Thompson's photo was taken in summer, which is known as the ablation period, and my photo was taken in winter, which is known as the accumulation period. So theoretically, glaciers should be accumulating more ice than in the winter than during the summer. And so this is again Hofsjökull. It's an outlet glacier of the very big glacier Vatnajökull. And this is again a different perspective on Hofsjökull. And as you can see, the glacier has lost volume on the top, but has also receded quite a bit. This is a different outlet glacier of Vatnajökull, and it's called Greater Mercurijökull. And as you can see, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but the glacier has lost a lot of volume on the top especially, and you can see that it's receded a bit as well, which is very telling of how climate change has been affecting glaciers. This is another outlet glacier of Vatnajökull called Fjallsjökull. And as you can see, it has lost quite a bit of volume, again, towards the top, but also it has receded, as you can tell from these little markers here. And so in the future, I will continue to collect research based on literature review and using other scientists' research. And I will also be compiling these images and tracing outlines of the position of the old glacier compared to the position of the new glacier. So, and that's it. I would especially like to thank Professor Doug Thompson, my thesis advisor, as well as my future reader, Professor Beverly Chominiak, the Goodwin Marine Center for the Environment, and Jen and Kelly, and of course Derek for the wonderful managing center and everything as well. And of course Professor Newby, who also taught the seminar this semester.
Thank you, Maddie. I'm just processing those images. Wow. To introduce our next student speaker, Professor Julia Flack, Sociology and Environmental Studies.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Adrian Beckford, who's working on a project on climate adaptation and resilience across the world. Adrian is an environmental studies major on the social science track and a Sheldon minor. And I just wanted to share a little story about how I met Adrian and sort of how I think about him when I've been meeting with him this whole semester. Adrian took my Climate and Society class in spring 2020. And he used an assignment called the Climate Journal, where people were supposed to kind of document how they were thinking about climate change throughout the day for the whole semester. And this produced a lot of text, obviously. But something that really stood out in Adrian's was that he wrote about a night with friends that seemingly had nothing to do with sociology or climate change or anything like that. And he found himself, I forget the specifics, like on a balcony in New York City or somewhere, and he kind of looked down and kind of the scale of human impact on the world came through to him in an interesting way. It was just very memorable, and I've always thought about that in our time together and been impressed by his work. So Adrian has really persisted, like so many of you have during this very difficult semester, and has been so gracious, sometimes reminding me that I needed to provide comments on something. So thanks, Adrian, for that, for helping me along and just really allowing me to learn through your project. So thanks.
So welcome everybody. Thank you again for being here. And thanks to Julia Flag for introducing me. As she said, my name is Adrian Beckford. I am a ES major in the social track and the government minor in the international relations track. I'm also obviously a Goodwin scholar in the Goodwin Center for the Environment. So how did I first become interested and passionate about the environment? In middle school and parts of high school, I wasn't really interested in the main subjects, maths, social studies, English, you name it. And it wasn't until my sophomore year of high school that I became really interested in climate change. So in sophomore year of high school, I saw this documentary, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth and Power. And this was a documentary by Al Gore starring Leonardo DiCaprio. And it kind of highlighted and showed what climate change was like in a bunch of different countries at the time. I think this was 2016 or 2017. They also showed what climate change was going to look like. And it scared me, I won't lie. But it also really inspired me. I realized that I could have a career moving forward in climate change, climate adaptation, and helping people. So I followed that path throughout middle school, throughout high school, and now to college and the center. So this is just a brief overview of my SIP timeline. After being accepted into the Good Engineering Center in the fall of 2020, we had to develop our guiding questions. And I knew I wanted to do something multinational, kind of a comparative analysis of climate change impacts across countries. And so that kind of meant that I had to do part of my SIP while I was abroad. So in the spring of 2022, I went abroad, and I also knew that I didn't want to write a 30, 40, maybe 50-page thesis. So I came up with the idea of creating a documentary. In the summer of 2022, I turned to add sustainable CT, which we'll be talking about next. And then in the fall of 2022, kind of finalizing my SIP, crafting the filming or the documentary and the paper. And then the past couple months, this is what I've been working on. So in the summer of 2022, after studying abroad, I interned at Sustainable CT. It's a 501c3, which is an NGO with an environmental basis. And it's actually created by the municipalities of Connecticut. So the main goal was to get them certified, the municipalities of Connecticut certified through us. And in order to do that, they had to do a bunch of sustainability projects within their communities. So that included things such as affordable housing, investing in renewable energy, and one of my personal favorites, doing climate vulnerability assessments. So I got to work with a consulting firm that looked at sea level rise in terms of Connecticut and making sure that our shorelines were adapted to that. That's kind of what I want to do in the future, and hopefully, fingers crossed, I get a job from that soon. So getting back to my SIP, I studied abroad. I initially got into a program that would have taken me to Morocco, Peru, and Nepal, which would have looked at climate change directly, the impacts that people were facing, and what they were doing to overcome that. Unfortunately, due to COVID and enrollment numbers, the program was canceled not once, but twice. So I had to kind of switch focus, and I chose another program that took me to Ecuador, Spain, and South Africa. So this program focused mainly on food justice, food sustainability, and since it was a honors type program, they expected us to do research over the 3 countries. So I took that opportunity with my SIP and this and combined them to create a comparative analysis on how food producers are adapting to climate change. So I also had to kind of ground myself in what is adaptation. So this quote here by Neil Adger, he's a professor at the University of Exeter and also a co-lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He says, some adaptation by individuals is undertaken in response to climate threats, often triggered by individual extreme events. So this is what I encountered mostly with my interviews with farmers, with food producers in the 3 countries that I visited. The quote continues, other adaptation is undertaken by governments on behalf of society, sometimes in anticipation of change. In anticipation of change, but again, often in response to individual events. And this is what I encountered more in my secondary research after reading lots of peer-reviewed articles and looking how governments wanted to adapt to climate change as a country on the country scale moving forward. So in terms of my research methods, with filming interviews, we met with a bunch of different people, whether it's family farms, co-ops, small-scale ag companies to large-scale ag companies. And unfortunately, a lot of these interviews were very impromptu. I didn't exactly know who I was going to be talking with and when I'd be talking with them. So I didn't get to film everything, but I learned a lot about the impacts that food producers were experiencing. And I learned how to build rapport with people before shoving a camera in their face. And so with my secondary research, I kind of grounded what I experienced in the field and gave myself a broader context of how these adaptations related to these countries as a whole. So these two combined were culminated in my SIP. Hopefully I'll be able to screen my documentary. It's a 3-piece part documentary, about half an hour long. In May, I don't have a date quite yet, but hopefully that happens. So what were the effects that were felt by people in these three different countries? As you can see, despite these countries being in very different parts of the world, there was a lot of overlap in the effects felt by farmers and food producers, from soil erosion to flooding, sandstorms, droughts, fires. And the bars kind of represent how much each country felt these things. So for Ecuador, for example, they felt a lot more flooding. Spain and South Africa, which have much more of an arid climate, felt more effects such as droughts, fires, sands. They don't have a lot of water in their environments. And so how do these food producers adapt to these changing climates? How do they continue producing food for their families, for their communities, for companies, whatever it is? I learned a lot about these different farming techniques, from agroecology to agroforestry. These first two were farming techniques kind of passed down from indigenous populations and adapted over time. We went to one of the most sustainable cacao and chocolate companies in the world in Ecuador. It was really cool to see. So they use agroforestry to plant their cacao plantations pretty much throughout the forest. So that they try to keep the forest as natural as possible. They don't want to do monocropping. They just plant it throughout the forest, let it be natural, and let natural processes choose which nutrients the cacao trees need to produce it. And it turns out that they were able to produce better, healthier cacao, produce more of whatever they needed. And it was just a really great adaptation strategy to the flooding that they were experiencing. Other adaptation strategies included reforestation. So in terms of arid climates where the soil is it's very crumbly, you're able to plant trees, different shrubs, whatever, and that kind of holds soil together so you're able to plant more. In terms of irrigation, for Ecuador, they had a lot of flooding, so they create lots of channels for water to flow where they needed it to go. And for South Africa and Spain, they would create irrigation so that water would be used in the most effective way. While these adaptation strategies were very interesting to learn about, a lot of the producers didn't tell me how these adaptations went beyond the individual level, how it affected the communities or the country as a whole. And that's what I came across when I started doing my research after study abroad with Professor Flag. And I found out a lot of these adaptation strategies actually decrease the inequalities, whether it is social, economic, financial, between genders. And a lot of these adaptation strategies not only were able to reduce or make them become resilient to the climate effects that they were feeling, but also produce healthier food, have food sovereignty, have an overabundance of food so they were able to create their own companies, start selling food in markets, which allowed women to become more empowered. They didn't have to rely on men in the families to start producing money for the family. And overall, for farmers to become more resilient and create better situations for themselves and the communities. So I just want to show you a quick part of the documentary. It's about 2 minutes long, so I'll try to play that here. It's just 3 random parts of the documentary kind of put together. It's not in chronological order, but just to give you an idea of what I saw and what I've been working on.
Quito, Ecuador, Barcelona, Spain, and Cape Town, South Africa. 3 extremely different countries, cultures, and regions of the world, but what they all have in common is experiencing firsthand the effects of climate change on their food systems. My name is Adrian Beckford, and I was lucky enough to travel to these places in order to get a grasp on how these three countries were experiencing climate change and how their world of food was being impacted. It amazed me that their solution to climate change was going back to their roots and traditional methods of farming through agroecology and analog farming, which work with nature and its natural processes to produce what they need. I then was lucky enough to explore the beautiful landscapes of Ecuador that many there called home, and every place I visited was nothing short of breathtaking. I eventually traveled back to the city to relax and get back in the learning mindset as I planned to talk to another farmer the next day who produces mini sugarcane. While visiting his farm earlier that month, he showed me their methods of production, but there was a lot of criticism towards the changing climate and the hardships of producing now. He says what's going to come in the future is even more worrying and uncertain.
Trabajo para una empresa que se llama Productos San José. Tenemos punto de injerencia en el noroccidente de Pichincha. Trabajamos en la cadena de valor de la caña de azúcar. Fabricamos y elaboramos panela, alcohol y derivados de la caña de azúcar. Entonces, yo considero que sí tenemos responsabilidad climática en el sentido de que vivimos de esto. Si yo hago bien las cosas, no hay ingresos en la familia o en la finca. Entonces, van a justificar a mis trabajadores, a los dueños, a las familias del grupo. Entonces, nosotros nos tenemos que mantener al margen de tiempo.
So this is a very short clip of it. It's going to be about half an hour. This was just from Ecuador, so it's going to also include Spain and South Africa in it. But that's just, I've only polished and finished the Ecuador part, so I just took parts of that. So special thanks to Julia Flagg and Sonia Misra, who helped me through this very long journey. Thank you to Jen and Kelly, obviously, for supporting us in everything, academic and non-academic. And thank you to Derek, who given us 2 great seminars in the Good Engineering Center, and to Michelle, who's also given our this current semester. So thank you.
Adrian, thank you. Everybody, we have to, Adrian, we have to find out when your screen is in all of the beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, even though I am not the relevant advisor. Kevin Rismiller worked with Professor Mara Satmani in the government department and is finishing up an honors thesis, in government. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight, so I get to have the pleasure of saying a couple things about Kevin. You'll just see in a minute how incredible his work is this year. Just speaking from personal experience and getting to know Kevin a little bit in the Good Engineering seminar, Kevin brings to every class discussion the kind of, want to say an activist perspective, but also like the perspective of a scholar of activism, kind of all at the same time, to every discussion. Always with kind of focus on, okay, what can be done next, what can be done next, and it's just been the best influence on just the intellectual culture of the center. So thanks, Kevin, for that, and thanks for sharing your work with us tonight.
Hi, everyone. Professor Suttman is actually currently across campus accepting a different award on my behalf. So I appreciate them allowing me to be in two places at once, kind of. So I'm Kevin. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a government major in sociology and economics double minor at the college, and a scholar in the Goodwin Ewing Center. And today I'll be presenting on my honors thesis research mapping the political shifts and impacts of the climate movement in the United States. But first, a brief history of the climate movement. In 1988, Dr. Hansen, a NASA scientist, testified in front of Congress on the threat of global warming. At that time, a number of the organizations within the environmental movement that had its heyday in the 1960s and 70s shifted over to climate to some degree. In 2009, we see the first congressional efforts to pass climate policy. This is known as the Waxman-Markey Bill, the American Clean Energy and Security Act for its technical term. And that bill did not ever get brought up in the Senate. It passed the US House of Representatives, but would have failed in the Senate if it was brought to a vote because of the Senate filibuster. The climate movement was kind of devastated from their inability to pass legislation, albeit technical cap and trade legislation in 2009, and several other movement forces started to take over. In the 2010s, you see the emergence of a lot of pipeline resistance efforts. Pictured here are protests in Washington, D.C. over the, I want to say, Standing Rock pipeline, but similar protests occurred over Keystone as well. And in 2019, we see the emergence of a Green New Deal. This is a decade after the Waxman-Markey bill failed in the Senate, and it's a radically different vision for climate policy. If anyone's had the chance to read the actual House resolution of a Green New Deal, it immediately centers marginalized populations, emphasis on union jobs, and all sorts of things that aren't traditionally associated with climate. In 2019, 18, 2020, we also see the emergence of a lot of youth climate activism, largely centered around this concept of a Green New Deal, which you can see in the top corner of the picture, asking Nancy Pelosi when she's going to support a Green New Deal. And we see the emergence of new organizations, the Sunrise Movement probably being the most prominent of those. And they're kind of quoted here in the Washington Post, saying that their goal is to reorient the entire project of government around addressing the climate crisis, not just to play party politics. And throughout this process, I adopt a few different kind of scholarly approaches. First and foremost, as Derek was referencing, an activist scholar approach. I started climate activism when I was 16, the classic kind of high school environmental club. And when the pandemic hit, I got heavily involved with the Sunrise Movement in Massachusetts, and have always wanted to center activist voices and experiences as activists, climate activists, democracy activists have provided me some of the best communities I've ever been a part of. And in that same vein, I tried to conduct movement-relevant theoretical research. Social movement theory is my kind of main discipline, and there are several major theories, resource mobilization, political process, that dominate the field. But too often activists see that work and can't see themselves in it. And so my goal is to kind of create research that answers the questions they want answered, and really lets them see themselves in the work. This thesis has three major research questions that I attempt to answer. First, how have actors within the climate movement accrued political power in the United States? Second, in what ways does this political power impact domestic climate politics? And third, how does the movement expand our understanding of social movement theory? I use 3 methods for this work, most prominently semi-structured open-ended interviews with a dozen climate activists. On average, these interviews lasted an hour and 25 minutes, and the average activist had 8.5 years of experience within the climate movement. The longest, I think, was 19 years, and the shortest was about 4 years. The second method I rely on a lot is social media and content analysis from newspapers. And then third, electoral and legislative rhetorical analysis as well. 2 major concepts emerged throughout my research on the social movement theory side of things, and then one kind of more on the government side of things. But social movement spillover is a major concept that initially started as an extension to this thesis in Professor Flores' class in the fall, and has been interwoven throughout the 150 pages of my thesis at this point. And social movement spillover refers to ideas, tactics, strategies shifting from one movement to another. Movements are often aware of each other. Pictured here is from a conference I was at of climate justice activists in New Orleans about a month ago. And the person on stage is one of the primary organizers of the Amazon labor union battles. And so it shows this kind of connection between the labor movement and the climate justice movement as well. The second idea, related in some ways, is collective identity. I've had the pleasure of being challenged by Professor Dawson in my junior fall during an independent study to grasp collective identity and kind of bring it down to earth, because I truly thought it was important as an activist, but theoretically it's been all over the place. And collective identity theorists are the first to admit that. But collective identity refers to the overarching kind of sense of belonging that's cultivated within a social movement. This is a hybrid typology that I propose throughout my research multiple times that breaks collective identity into movement identity, organizational identity, and activist identity. And then I look at the climate movement itself. I sampled 8 organizations throughout that dozen interviews, and I wanted to make sure I was interviewing activists with organizations that were really impacting the debate around climate politics. So here's a graph that I created that maps organizations' mentions in the New York Times. The most kind of notable aspect of this, ignoring my biases towards Sunrise, is that this gray line that you see in 2020, the most mentioned organization was Sunrise, and yet Sunrise didn't exist in 2017. It first came into being in 2017, and it unseated a lot of the big green Sierra Club-esque organizations as the top mentioned organization in the paper of record in the United States in just 3 years. I have interviewed activists at most of these organizations. Some of their identities are more protected than others, but I've interacted with all of these organizations in some capacity. So it brings me to my findings. I center a lot of the activist voices in the agenda setting, and these fun pictures of the 300 pages of transcripts that a few of my friends in the room made me take at 1 a.m. A few days before going to Baltimore for a conference. But to present the activist voices themselves, one activist from the League of Conservation Voters was referencing a shift in the movement. That shift I described earlier in the history from this kind of big green dominated technocratic movement. I'm about to graduate with a minor in economics, and I can barely explain cap and trade to you if asked. And that shift and who perpetuated that shift, brought that shift about. They point out that in 1991, there was the People of Color Summit, where a number of environmental justice organizations critiqued big green organizations for ignoring justice in the work that they do. The activist also points out that there were 11 when that was written. I wasn't alive when that was written. But in 2010, when the Waxman-Markey bill was presented in the Senate, the environmental justice communities were largely left out of that effort. And that bill largely lacked any grassroots support. Another activist references how that shifted and why it shifted, saying, and you actually have to talk explicitly about race and about class and write programs that appeal to people's interests. That's how people can feel that they're actually represented or reflected, or it's an organization or program that they want to be a part of. And adding that they never forget or never regret being more climate justice focused in their work. Sunrise was a large catalyst to this new movement identity that emerged from the climate movement. Another Sunrise leader who is still with the organization, that founder has since cycled out, said to me, I feel like the Green New Deal, honestly, was one of the big turning points. It has become an all holistic, all systems approach that covers everything from education to housing to transportation. Everyone can see themselves in a vision of a Green New Deal. I think that's a really important component of that identity transformation. And then I look towards media framing. A Green New Deal is a concept that's been around since Obama, even before Obama in some regards, but it had little traction anywhere. The New York Times barely mentioned it for those 9 years. It's since been referenced 350 times in the New York Times since 2017. And the references are really important of how. So the climate movement adopted this much more progressive, kind of confrontational tone within the Democratic coalition, pushing Democrats to the left, asking if Joe Biden can win the climate activists over and not the other way around, and acknowledging that despite the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the first climate law in United States history, young activists are demanding more and weren't remotely satisfied. And then turning towards the electoral impacts of the movement, I had the pleasure of working with Sunrise on Senator Markey's reelection efforts. He introduced the Green New Deal into the US Senate, and he was facing a very strong primary challenge in 2020 by one of the Kennedys. And if you're from Massachusetts, you've just heard of the Kennedys all the time for your entire life. But despite being counted out and told he should retire a year before the election, he ended up winning by 11 points in a really profoundly powerful victory for a Green New Deal and the climate movement. Similarly, the climate movement mobilized significantly around the 2020 elections, largely supporting the Bernie side of the Democratic Party over the Biden side of the Democratic Party. But when the two created a unity task force on a myriad of issues, including climate, one of the co-founders of the Sunrise Movement was put onto that task force to develop Joe Biden's climate policy. They've also had notable losses. Jessica Cisneros ran for Congress along the lines of a Green New Deal in Texas against a conservative Democrat and lost by 300 votes. But also notable House victories. Summer Lee won in 2022, campaigning on a Green New Deal in the Pittsburgh area. And bringing it back to Markey for a moment, this was, as an activist, really satisfying to see, but rarely do politicians kind of credit who gets them to where they need to go or what movements get them to where they need to go. And Markey, in his victory speech, says that winning was a reaffirmation of the need to have a movement, a progressive movement of young people demanding radical change, demanding justice, a movement giving voice and power to young people when for far too long they were ignored. This was a very fascinating aspect of my research, but I wanted to dig deeper into the legislative impacts of the movement. And so I compare efforts of the Waxman Markey era and the Inflation Reduction era, and you can see the difference in how even legislators talk about it, referencing Waxman Markey as a complex bill for a complex problem, and really emphasizing the carbon pollution aspect of the climate crisis. Whereas Rep. Castor, the former chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which Republicans very quickly dismantled when they took power in 2022, crediting their passage of the Inflation Reduction Act to the young people around the country mobilizing, pushing Washington to act for the first time. And you can also see Republican efforts to divide the kind of climate coalition that exists. Senator Grassley saying that the Inflation Reduction Act is anything close to a Green New Deal is already a stretch, but also that it's throwing blue-collar workers aside when that's not what the Democratic climate policy would do. And bringing it back to the activist voices, because at the end of the day, they are who I want to center. The climate movement has gotten really far in the sense of passing the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the top activists noted that it's not enough, and it's just the power that the movement had in 2022. And there's reasons for that. There are significant anti-majoritarian hurdles to passing legislation in the United States. It's often that very few Americans are satisfied with the United States government, but we fail to dig deeper a lot of the time. So I started to ask activists about how those anti-majoritarian features, whether it be the Senate filibuster or money in politics or gerrymandering, impacted their work. One referenced how it felt like they were playing a game of chess, but the other person got 10 moves for every single one they got. And another said that the movement hasn't even reckoned with those anti-majoritarian features. So I kind of proposed this understanding, or this like depiction of the climate movement as this access-oriented era, then a spillover phase where a number of justice movements influenced the climate movement, and then the emergence of a Green New Deal era. And then just to conclude, and kind of the social movement theory side of things, my research acknowledges the power of social movement spillover in transforming the goals and strategies of a movement, and that these shifts have to do with increasing the movement's political power, but more must be accrued to reach a Green New Deal, and that the climate movement has radically shifted the Democratic Party's approach to the climate policy, but will be hindered by those anti-majoritarian institutions until they take them head on. And then my research proposes a model for understanding and mapping how social movements influence politics. And thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Sutman for all of their support throughout these last couple of years. We've been meeting weekly or more often for a year and a half of my life at this point, as well as Professor Dawson for challenging me to explore social movement theory and kind of make it accessible, and Professor Flagg for all of their support, as well as Professor Flores for giving me the space to explore social movement spillover, the Goodwin Nearing staff, and the Goodwin Environmental Research Fellowship that has allowed me to travel literally all over the country for this research and meet activists face to face rather than over Zoom calls.
So one thing I have particularly been looking forward to this evening is I get to see Elaine Zhang present on her work again. We worked together last fall on her SIP on turn conservation and use of GIS mapping. I want to actually also give a shout out to Professor Beth Choniak, who helped Elaine at every step of the way in constructing GIS maps of turn nesting sites in Massachusetts. So you'll see kind of what those results look like. For me, it was just really, really fun to spend our meetings week in, week out last fall semester talking about like the advantages of pros and cons of certain ways of representing data. Like what are some things that you can kind of see, when you conservation relevant things that you can see when you construct a map that maybe you might not see when data represented in other ways. So it's really, really terrific work. So I want to welcome Elaine. Did Elaine disappear? I don't see Elaine. Elaine, okay. I was like, okay, yeah, great. Maybe we'll hold for a while. We have our session runs until like 6. So maybe what we'll do is go ahead and take some time for Q&A for the other talks, and if Elaine finds her way back in, we can hand things right over to her and this time, hopefully. So, good. I wonder if the rest of you, Kevin, Vaughn, Maddie, Anna, would you like to come up to the front and hang out up here and maybe see if there's any questions? Is that Second session, I wonder if maybe, yeah, we might have just had like a miscommunication and she thought she was going in second.
Sessions at one point.
Oh, okay, thank you. We might have had a little bit of mix up about the order, but that's okay. We can, if you're interested in Elaine's talk, make sure you catch the second session. Good. Questions for the group? Yeah.
Move on. So for, like some of the other products that have been, coming out in like 2023 for, as like a reusable alternative for menstruation products, have you looked at all at like, period underwear? Because I think those are really interesting.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the period underwear. That might be a little too much information, but I think it's awesome. However, Thinks has just come under, I think in like the past year, there's a lawsuit about like some toxins that they found in the underwear. They're still trying to like deal with that. The research that I've found on that underwear is that like Thinks doesn't intend to have like any of the bad stuff in the underwear at all. I think like through production, they're saying that some of the that's like not my forte, like the chemicals in all the products, but I think the lawsuit has like been settled because I don't think anything bad has come out of that. But the period underwear is great. I just think they don't last as long than like other products do. But also like the menstrual disc is a really cool technology too. It's supposed to fit women's cervixes like different than like a menstrual couplet. So if people like don't find comfort in the menstrual cup, the menstrual disc is also a good option, and then the period underwear. I can't like confidently say to go ahead with the menstrual underwear since I know that there has been a lawsuit and people are worried about that, but Things is still on the market and no bad intentions there. Thank you.
Yeah,
Question for Anna?
Yeah.
So you, we're looking at a bunch of different errors of writing. And, you know, certainly I think environmental issues have, you know, come over time, you know, up at different times. But certainly there's a you know, very more modern understanding of what environmentalism means and so forth. I'm curious, do you see any differences in how earlier versus more recent poetry really speaks to that? I mean, do you find that older material still really very relevant, or?
Yeah, you know what's fascinating about that question is I think that I was really looking at like the yearning for like love and connection and nostalgia for the environment. And what's interesting is that remains the same, you know, from like the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century is what I was looking at. And I think that we start to see poems like one poem that I had was, I don't know what will kill us first, the race war, or what we've done to Earth. And I think that those type of poems weren't emerging until the mid-20th century. But that love and nostalgia and this feelings of pleasure and connection to nature remained the same. And that's one thing that I found to be like very special because, you know, it kind of just proves that as a society and as like a human nature that we're like born to love the place that we live, which I feel like sometimes that gets lost in some of the modern, you know, news that we're seeing, not just in poetry. But I feel like there are definitely poems like I don't know what will kill us first, the race war, what was done to Earth. Those type of poems start to emerge within the mid 20th century. But that love that I was looking at for the Earth that we inhabit stays the same, which I really like.
Great question for Kevin. So this is very much, the politicization of climate is very much a United States story, right? And your document, it's just amazing, your work. I guess I'm curious about what you think are the kind of global ramifications, if any, of what you've identified in the US, right? So this is a very strong focus on domestic policy, the shifts in the domestic movement. Outside of the confines of the United States, what are the implications of your research?
Yeah, I think that I mean, I've taken global environmental policy courses, and I understand the global climate regime, and I've read those agreements, but at the end of the day, there isn't any global government, right? And so, any of those agreements are only as strong as the government's a part of them. President Biden re-entered the United States into the Paris Agreement in large part because of the pressure that he would feel amongst the climate movement and activists. I do think the way in which the United States crafts policy has really significant global implications. And so the climate movement would pressure, at this point, the center of gravity in the climate movement would pressure the United States to really rethink its dedication to capitalism. That would have ramifications throughout the entire world's economic order. But at the same time, the Inflation Reduction Act, when it was passed, includes provisions that 40% of the materials for the electric vehicle tax credits, for example, need to come from the United States. And that really upset the Europeans. So the ways in which we go about that policy can have kind of consequences globally on our allies in the climate crisis battle.
I have a question for Madeline regarding the photographs and that kind of methodology of tracking changes in glaciers. I'm wondering if, as a sort of methodology for gauging change over time, is it really for the viewer just to sort of like look at a series of photographs over time and kind of make a general kind of narrative conclusion about, you can see where it's getting smaller and so forth, or can those photographs, or are they also kind of quantified, for lack of a better term? You know, if you took a photo from the exact same place, you could conceivably, I guess, use some computer software to sort of measure it and quantify reductions in size and that sort of thing.
So I think that that's definitely possible if you have like a good like baseline. I was working with images that were not meant to be recreated. So in my case, it will be more of like a visual aspect of documenting the change. And then the literature review will, and it's really a way to supplement the literature review. So I won't be doing that. I'm sure there are scientists who have better methods who can do that though.
Is there like any good news anywhere in the world about glaciers? Because all you ever see is these before and after pictures, and it's weird.
I'm sad to say that I have not really heard any good news. In fact, I've only heard the worst. I heard that a few years ago they held a funeral for a glacier in Iceland. So I'm sorry, but there's nothing good.
I mean, I thought that was the case, but just
For Madeline, can you tell everyone more about what like the glacier guides and people said about what they've seen and the decrease of the glaciers just visually for them?
Yeah, so when I was in Iceland, I had the opportunity to go visit an ice cave. And our guide, ice caves form in the winter and they are gone in the summer, but they generally form in the same area of the glacier each year. However, our guide mentioned that every year the ice cave gets further and further away from the original parking spot because that's how much the glacier has receded. And Braden Mercurial, which is one of the glaciers that I visited, outlet glaciers that I visited, is actually the fastest retreating outlet glacier in Iceland. And according to the guides, that particular outlet glacier retreats hundreds of meters every year. So it's a pretty big difference per year.
Question for Adrian, your documentary, is it like showing climate change or is it giving awareness to the public about climate change? What does it really tell us at the end? Just one question. The other one is, do you see any difference? You travel to Spain and then Ecuador, right? It's good, one is in Europe, one is in South. So do you see any difference between their actions or reactions to the climate change?
Yeah, so for the first part, I didn't go through the IRB, which is like I don't know what it stands for, but it's basically the ethics board. So doing documentaries, you have to go through that in order to publish any videos with interviews. So I didn't go through that since it was I was making it up on the spot. So it's only going to be published for kinetic ecologist uses. In terms of the second part, a lot of people in Ecuador were actually very upbeat about their situation. They didn't find, they felt that they had the resources necessary to adapt to a lot of the flooding and rain changes. South Africa and Spain were a little bit more worried about their situation just because of the arid and kind of Mediterranean climates are a little harder to deal with fires constantly destroying farms and land that you can farm on. South Africa, same thing, a lot of sand storms, so that ruins a lot of crops. They have to actually, I was impressed that they were able to plant things in the sand, so the soil wasn't actually like earth, it was sand, and they kind of figured out how to do that. But overall, people were pretty upbeat about finding adaptation strategies to continue farming. So I'm hopeful. Yeah.
I have a question for everyone. What do you feel like you got most out of your project or how it might change your perspective? I can go first. This is actually like referencing Derek's seminar, which is about pessimism and optimism. And I feel like my project made me more of an optimist than a pessimist when it comes to thinking about the environment, which was something like that I hold in my heart just because I really felt like a pessimist for really a long time. And I think coming into college, I felt like a pessimist. And then being bombarded with all this like bad news at all times about our climate and the world. And I think that focusing on healing and love and restoration and concepts like gratitude and reciprocity and those things really turned me from a pessimist into an optimist. And I know that I'm still taking being an optimist with a grain of salt, but I think that in general it was something transformative for me in my journey in my last year. So Derek, to answer your question that you posed at the seminar, I'm now an optimist.
I really loved being able to travel, just experience different cultures, going to 3 different countries and being able to compare them, both from an academic standpoint, but also a cultural standpoint, was really eye-opening. Just being able to meet different people, different viewpoints of the world. And it's kind of instilled in me like a passion for travel. I just went to Morocco for spring break. And yeah, I just want to keep traveling, keep seeing what I can do with kind of adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, you know me outside of this, but my thesis research has very much been everything to me for a year and a half. But more so, like the questions my thesis ruminates on and attempts to tackle and the conversations I've had with activists they've been a part of my life for 6 years, and they'll be a part of my life for years to come. And so I think for me, it's just having the opportunity, having the time and place to tell the story of these just wonderful people trying to make our world a better place despite all of the challenges and hardships to it. And the communities they build and the friends they make along the way is honestly a gift. I've gone to these academic conferences where I'm in the room with all these academics and I have to present on my research. And at one of them, one person came up to me afterwards, and the thing they said to me was, "Your passion for the subject comes through so clearly, and it's so refreshing in these spaces." And my chance, my opportunity, my privilege to be able to bring in the voices of my friends and honestly comrades in the climate movement is truly a gift. And so I really just appreciated that opportunity to be able to do that.
I can go next. So I felt like through this project, I've been able to like combine two of my really great passions, like photography and glaciers. I've always found glaciers fascinating, and I feel like utilizing photography as a tool to help demonstrate the changes that climate change has been has driven to these glaciers. I feel like that has been really a really great experience for me, and I feel like it's made me even more passionate about both photography and studying glaciers in the future.
Okay, so I'm last, and I needed a minute to think about this question, so thank you. I guess like the thing that I got most out of this project is just that like I can do research about something that I'm really interested in. I had a really horrific period story from 6th grade that has led me down this path. I've always been interested in like the shame and the embarrassment and like the stigmatization that like surrounds periods. So just like getting to look at the history of that and like do my best to like think of ways to alter that perception of like menstruation and like actually finding I don't want to say like a solution, but one of many solutions that's like very tangible. And I feel like something as someone who like, is interested in policy and like schools and youth education, to like find something that can be implemented in schools through policy that's already happening is super interesting. Like I would love to be able to like get into something like this so that we could like help little 6th graders not feel like embarrassed about their periods and also have like access to these products that like can help them for a long time.
I wonder, we're pretty close to breaking for our break. Elaine is here. I want to apologize to Elaine. I think we got our signals crossed, and I thought you were going to be in the first session, and we told you it was the second session. So I wonder if you want to go next. Would you like to go now, or if we can wait?
I can go.
Would you like to? Yeah, if everyone is willing to, let's go. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks to all of you. Great. I'm gonna, so Elaine again. I'm gonna introduce Elaine again. So, because she didn't get so I'm really excited to see this presentation in particular, partly because it's been a little while since we worked together, and it was so much fun. Getting to work week by week and talk about almost like we were doing some conservation biology, some philosophy of science, some thinking about how you represent data, and we're kind of having these philosophical discussions while Elaine was working with Professor Choniak to actually construct really cool GIS maps to contribute to turn conservation. So that's just a really, really cool project, and it's happy for me to be able to take a last look at it. So Elaine.
My name is Elaine, and my project is about geographic information systems and seabird conservation. I'll be talking about why seabirds matter and how we can use GIS for seabird conservation. So to provide a brief description of GIS, it's a set of tools that you can use to work with geographic data. You can use it to identify trends and relationships with your data. You can make better and more informed decisions as it can tell you where things are, how they are related, what is nearby, and what has changed over time. GIS is used in a wide variety of applications like urban planning, politics, agriculture, transportation, and utilities, just to name a few. Last summer, I did a seabird conservation internship in Massachusetts with Mass Wildlife. Their ongoing project aims to monitor and restore the common and roseate populations on Bird, Ram, and Penikese Islands in Buzzards Bay through nest surveys, vegetation management, and predator control. And here are some pictures of the islands. The top left is Bird Island, in the middle right is Ram Island, and then the bottom left is Penikese Island. It wasn't actually initially a part of my plan to work with seabirds. But when I was applying for internship last summer, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I wasn't very diligent in looking for internships. So when the time came, I only had like 2 options. And I went with this one because it sounded more interesting to me. And I'm glad I did because I got to learn a lot about seabirds, including that seabirds don't get as much attention as many other animals because they're not considered to be as charismatic or majestic. But that doesn't mean seabirds they're less important. It's just that people tend to prioritize aesthetic value in their decisions on which species to protect. Nonetheless, I think seabirds deserve attention because they are important and they are threatened. In fact, about 28% of seabirds are threatened and another 10% are near threatened. The threats that they face include habitat loss, fisheries interactions, climate change, pollution, and predator species. Seabirds are important because they are ecosystem engineers. They are ecosystem engineers. They alter island ecosystems through physical disturbance and nutrient transport that affects soil and plants, which could lead to better soil fertility, higher plant growth rates, and faster ecological succession from newly formed islands. There are many ways GIS can be used for seabird conservation. You can track and monitor seabird populations and distribution. That can help you learn about their migration patterns, biodiversity, and habitat locations. That information can help with conservation planning and finding areas in need of interventional management. You can perform site suitability analyses to help locate suitable habitats for seabirds. And then in addition, GIS mapping can help formulate research questions or bring them into focus. Because with GIS maps, we can see patterns and relationships that would be a lot harder to see if you only are looking at tables. I wanted to focus on the least terns for my project because it's another tern species in Massachusetts, and I didn't get to work with them over the summer. I knew that they change nesting sites a lot, and I was curious to see if there would be any interesting patterns that can come with making maps. These terns are listed as species of special concern or threatened in many states. They spend their winters in Central and South America, and they breed in North and Central America. They prefer nesting in places that have little to no vegetation, like sandy beaches and shallow beaches or gravelly substrates. Least terns are important to conserve because they help maintain healthy coastal ecosystems. They, by controlling prey populations and providing for predator populations. They are highly mobile and susceptible to human disturbance, habitat loss, and predators like foxes, raccoons, and dogs and cats. For the GIS portion of my project, I attempt to follow their movement and shift of nesting sites on Cape Cod over the years by mapping their populations using data from 1985 to 2022. At the bottom, you see this graph shows the number of nesting pairs of least terns in all of Massachusetts from 1985 to 2022. There were a lot of fluctuations between 2010 and 2022. We think it's because the terns are moving around a lot and it's getting harder for data collectors to keep up with them. I'll be showing the maps for 1985, 2003, 2011, 2017, and 2022 to see how they move throughout the years. Here's the first map. I made the background imagery transparent so you can see the nesting sites. And I also highlighted and circled the nesting sites that most of the birds go to each year. So in 1985, we see that most of them were on the eastern and the southern coast. From 1985 to 2003, a lot of them left the east and almost all of them were on the left side. Between 2003 and 2011, more and more began to settle in the southeastern region over here at this corner. And then from 2011 to 2017, there were a lot fewer birds in the south and west. More and more of them were moving to the east and the southeast corner. And lastly, between 2017 and 2022, even more of them went to the southeastern region on the right side. So the most obvious pattern to me was the southeast corner of Cape Cod and how it rapidly gained popularity among the least terns in the 2010s. This area is called Monomoy Island, and least terns were first observed there in 1984, but it wasn't until 2003 that I saw a large number of them. The numbers rapidly increased to 104 pairs in 2011, to 522 pairs in 2015, 770 pairs in 2017, and 585 pairs in 2022. Another pattern that I saw was that there was a rapid decrease in nesting terns in the southern coast. The nesting sites along the southern coast had always supported a large number of terns up until 2013. But in 2013, it went down to 74 pairs from 680 pairs in 2011. I tried to find explanations for the pattern that I saw. I found out these patterns are likely related to shoreline changes, coastal development, and conservation efforts. I'll talk more about the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge in a bit. The shorelines of Cape Cod have constantly been shaped by coastal erosion, from wind, waves, storms, and sea level fluctuations. The currents bring the sand south to Chatham and Monomoy. And so this area is constantly modified by sand as sand travels there. Because of erosion, openings appear and disappear and islands connect and disconnect at different times. As you can see for the images, many drastic changes have occurred over time, creating suitable and unsuitable bird habitats at different times. Coastal development is likely responsible for the least terns leaving the southern coast. We have two maps comparing land use in 1971 and 1999, and showing how coastal areas are turning more into residential, commercial, and recreational properties, as represented by the purple. As humans occupy more beaches, it leads to more human disturbance and habitat loss for the least terns. The rapid increase of least tern populations in Monomoy is also due to effective conservation measures by the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge contains wetlands, beaches, and shrublands that provide suitable resting, nesting, and foraging habitats for migratory birds. The constant movement and deposition of sand and sediments at Monomoy Island creates more nesting areas for least terns. They also do predator control and vegetation management. So these habitats help attract a lot of least terns from other parts of Cape Cod as well. And some of the things that you can do to help protect least terns are to respect areas that are fenced off and posted to help protect seabirds. You should keep a distance from seabirds so to avoid stressing them out. You should keep your pets leashed and don't leave trash behind on beaches that they can attract predators that might go after the easters and their eggs. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Special thanks to Derek Turner, my project advisor, and Betty Chomiak for helping with the maps, and Mass Wildlife for providing the data.
Sorry, James, you for getting our scheduling a little bit mixed up, but maybe in a minute, two before we break, if anyone has a question for about her talk just now, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. In the beginning of the presentation, you say that one of the factors that influence the birds is one of the is fisheries. How do fisheries impact?
So it's mostly the fish industry with their nets. The birds get caught in the nets. Yeah, that's mostly the issue.
So is that done?
Yeah, she answered.
I think you show that the pairs, there's a dramatic increase in number of birds. So it's because due to conservation efforts and all these things. Is it this rapid increase? I mean, it's not balanced. Isn't that the problem? Is there any effort to control this population?
So this graph is showing the tern populations in Massachusetts only. And near the back, it's going up and down. It's because like the birds move around a lot. It's hard to keep track of them. So that's been an issue. The population of these terns has been slowly increasing in Massachusetts. That's been a trend.
So is that the problem? Is it a good thing or bad?
What the conservation efforts have been working. Yeah. The problem is just that just has been a lot of like coastal development and human disturbances infringing on the beaches.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so it's, disturbing to hear about added development and the impact on the birds, but in spite of increased development, the conservation efforts are counteracting that, and you see them continuing to increase, so like you said, the conservation efforts are working in spite of the really dramatic increase in development that we saw.
Yes, at least in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Doug?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting comparison actually in a very different kind of environment. So piping plovers and sandhill cranes in Nebraska on the Platte River, their populations are heavily impacted because of water reductions, which essentially took a river that had a lot of islands and connected those islands to the sides of the banks. And so predators kind of came onto the islands and started eating the nests and so forth. And so, it doesn't surprise me at all that the connection and, disconnection of the islands made a big difference on Cape Cod. I'm wondering, is there any data on nesting success rate? It'd be interesting to see when the islands disconnect, are the nests kind of more successful in rearing the young versus other years?
I didn't find information on the nesting success rate when the islands go apart, but they like when there's not a lot of vegetation on the islands. So when the sand goes to the south and builds all these islands, they don't have much vegetation on them. So I would assume that their success rate goes up because there's less vegetation.
I don't know. Elaine, I feel bad maybe asking the last question because we've talked so much about this. But I wonder if I could maybe jump in with the last question. I'm just kind of looking at your maps this time. Kind of like one of the obviously big things you're showing is that the nesting sites are moving around. Like the birds are really changing their nesting preferences pretty dramatically over time. This one, and I feel like we probably talked about this in the fall, and it just kind of. But I'm wondering, what would the birds be doing if it weren't for human impacts, for coastal, like you talked about coastal development or people's use of beach areas and stuff like that, is it possible that the birds would still be, kind of changing their nesting site preferences? Or is that really, based on what you've seen, like you think a response to the human activities?
Yes, that's mainly the reason they're moving around, because of human disturbance.
It's human disturbance.
Yes. So without human disturbance, they wouldn't be moving around as much because there wouldn't be as much disturbance.
Yeah. Well, thanks. We should take a break because we have session 2 coming up before tomorrow. Thanks. We do have some pizza right out here. Down the hall in building 203. Yeah. So everyone's welcome to come on down. We have some pizza, refreshments down that way. 203.
Thank you, Elaine. You're the best. Way to kill